Gentleman from North Carolina, Mr. Walker, is recognized for 60 minutes as the designee of the Majority Leader. Gentleman from North Carolina.
Before I begin, I ask unanimous consent that all members may have 5 legislative days in which to revise and extend their remarks and include extraneous materials on the topic of my special order.
Without objection, so ordered.
Tonight is a night about accountability, about taking responsibility. Many of my colleagues that will speak here tonight were sent by districts of people who wanted to hold this government accountable in the areas of both fiscal and social arena. You know, I think back today that was unplanned. On June the 15th, 1775, 240 years ago this very day, George Washington accepted the position as Commander-in-Chief of the Continental Army. Washington was serving in the Second Continental Congress as a delegate from Virginia when his peers voted unanimously to hand him the reins of the entire Revolutionary Army. About 100 paces from where I'm standing, at the back of these chambers, standing in the Capitol's rotunda, is the history of how America was birthed into existence. It is displayed through the most glorious artwork. Of all those paintings in the rotunda, I am most intrigued by John Trumbull's work on Washington submitting his resignation in 1783 after completing his assignment through struggles and severe setbacks, more than 8 years after accepting the position. Now, while some of these paintings depict those of conquests or discoveries, this particular work captures the great character of Washington. You see, Congress had granted Washington the powers equivalent to a dictator. Yet the humility and the wisdom of Washington understood that for a republic to survive, it must be held accountable by the people. His resignation that day stated this: "I resign with satisfaction the appointment I accepted with diffidence, or lack of self-confidence in my own abilities to accomplish so arduous a task, which, however, was superseded by a confidence in the rectitude of our cause, the support of the supreme power of the Union, and the patronage of heaven." You see, Washington had resolved that a citizen-ruled government, though different than others in the past, had a chance to do something, to be something exceptional. 240 years ago today, Washington laid the cornerstone of freedom through accountability to the people with a unique blessing from the divine power of heaven. That's why we've assembled tonight, to talk about what Washington's vision was: a citizen-ruled government that would hold the federal government and this administration accountable. Tonight, I'd like to introduce the chairman of the House and Oversight Committee, a committee that I'm privileged to serve with, someone who's been a champion on government oversight. I yield to the chairman, Mr. Chaffetz.
I thank the gentleman, and I thank those who are with us tonight, because this topic is one of, I think, the most important to our nation. It certainly was key to the foundation of this nation, and the gentleman is right, Mr. Walker, because if you go back and you read that farewell address that Washington gave, it's one of the most inspirational pieces, because he had the power, he had the position, he had the respect of the people, but he did probably the most admirable thing that we've seen in this nation, in that he voluntarily gave it up. Because he knew that the power didn't reside in the president. He knew that the power didn't reside in him as an individual. He understood that the power of this nation stood with the people. And with that power comes a responsibility. It's a responsibility that all of us hold as citizens of the United States of America. For it's truly a privilege and honor to be a citizen in this country. And I hearken back a couple hundred years ago to those who blazed new trails and decided that this nation was going to be an inspired nation, inspired by God, that we weren't bashful about recognizing that God played a role in our lives and that the power of prayer was an important part of our nation. But also incumbent upon that was that every man, woman, and child, every able-bodied person do their part. that we all had accountability and responsibility, not only to take care of ourselves, but to also do what we can to help foster a greater community. See, this was a new idea. It wasn't that way across the world. There were dictators and there were others that really wanted to rule and control people. But the inspiration that our founders had and the foundation of our nation was rooted in this idea that the people had the power. And so fast forward now to those who serve, whether they serve in the armed services, whether they serve in the federal government or the state government or wherever they might serve, it should be a recognition that we serve the American people, that we serve them. And so as we look at all the issues that face us, whether we're going to spend money, whether we should pass this bill or not, let's remember a couple things, because, and I would mention this to the gentleman from North Carolina, Mr. Walker, because I know he knows this and I know it, but I want my kids to know it, that as we look at things we do in Congress, as we look at the men and women who serve our nation, most do it in a very admirable way. They're patriotic, they're hardworking, they care about this nation. But we have some that don't really meet that standard. And it is probably most fair, most humane, most decent that we hold people to a high standard. You know, one of the things I want my kids to understand about government, about life in general, is that when they talk about the government and they talk about the federal government, it's really interesting. We'll have this happen in our committee from time to time. We'll say, well, whose money is it? And they'll say, well, it's the government's money. No, it's not. It's the people's money. See, every time we decide to spend money in Congress, what we're really deciding is, should we pull money out of somebody's pocket? Should we pull money out of your wallet, take it over here, and hand it to somebody else? Now, there's some worthwhile causes to do that, right? There's some worthwhile things to do. The protection of our nation for our armed services. I buy that. I get that. But we're spending far too much money on too many things. We can't be all things to all people. So going back to my original premise here, as I try to teach my own kids and try to remember myself, we have to be exceptionally responsible stewards of these assets and resources that aren't ours. They're an individual's. For you see, at the heart of this is something that I think President Washington understood, that the most powerful thing upon our nation is the power of the people, and it's their own self-determination that should rule the day. You limit their self-determination, the more you regulate them, and the more you pull that money directly out of their pockets and give it to somebody else. Now, there's room for regulation, there's room for certain things in the public good. But I tell you, most of what happens, most of what goes on in Washington, it's far too much. It's excessive. And we have to remember at its core that accountability and responsibility for those of us that are fortunate enough to serve in a public role is imperative. But it's also imperative that each individual takes upon themselves their own accountability and their own responsibility. As able-bodied men and women, children, you got to pull your own weight. You got to carry your own bucket. You got to do what you got to do, not only to help yourself, but to help your community, your friends and loved ones as well. And that's the heart of what I think the gentleman from North Carolina, Mr. Walker, brings to this body. I know he cares about it passionately. It's what we're here talking about tonight. And there's a host of examples where we're not holding people accountable, and we want to change that. I hope we're able to talk about that a bit tonight. But for the moment, I would say to the gentleman, thank you for allowing me to participate. And with that, I'll yield back for the moment. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. We are going to talk about some specific egregious behavior. It wasn't long that I was here and serving with Chairman Chaffetz on the House Oversight that we were requested to meet with the Inspector General of the EPA. It was in that moment, only weeks after that I had arrived, that here we have an Inspector General, a gentleman appointed by the President, who had reached out to us in his tireless efforts to even so much to get the EPA to respond. The arrogance that stems from that agency has been grossly misused and abused. And it's my privilege tonight to acknowledge one of my North Carolina colleagues to talk specifically more about the Environmental Protection Agency. And with that, I yield to the fine colleague from the Charlotte area, Mr. Richard Hudson.
I thank my colleague, Mr. Walker, for yielding the time. Also, thank you for your strong leadership here in Congress. You know, often a new member of Congress comes to town and spends a little bit of time learning the ropes, maybe sitting in the back row and observing. But that's not true of Mark Walker. Mark Walker has quickly become a leader in Congress, and particularly on issues such as this. Tonight, the People's Night, government accountability is the topic. And I thank the gentleman for bringing up the issue of the EPA. We had a hearing Friday in the Energy and Commerce Committee, on which I serve, in which we had the acting assistant administrator who oversees the Clean Air Act. And we're looking at this new proposed rule that the EPA has put out, having to do with ground level ozone. Now, in 2008, the EPA issued a rule that brought the levels of ground level ozone down to 75 parts per billion. Now, based on that number, many counties in North Carolina and across this country were out of attainment. Now, everyone wants clean air. Everyone wants clean water. Even those of us who are concerned about jobs know that if you don't have clean air and clean water, you can't attract industry, you can't have businesses grow in your community. But you have to look at the real science, and you have to look at the real numbers. And the truth is, since 1980, we've cut ground level ozone levels 30% in this country. We've done a tremendous job, and that's been driven by industry. And this new rule was issued in 2008, but the instructions to states weren't issued until March of this year. And so in March of this year, the EPA finally told states how to comply with these new levels of 75 parts per billion. But now they've come out with a new rule that says we're going to drop that to 65 or maybe even 60. Now, if that's the case, every county in North Carolina except one county in western North Carolina would be out of attainment. So what does that mean? That means you can't have a road project. It means you can't build a new home. It means you can't add any jobs to any existing industry. It means you can't bring any new industry into the state. And they're doing this at a time when we haven't implemented the old rule, when we've already cut ground level ozone 30%. And so what I would say is, let's wait and look at the science. Let's look at the real health impacts. Let's see what the results of the current regulations are before we rush out with some new regulations, which we're told could cost as much as 270,000 jobs in North Carolina. I've seen the figure of 1.3 billion jobs in the country, million jobs in the country, 1.3 million jobs. Before we bring on this cost, before we threaten these jobs, before we basically shut down all growth and development, let's take a look at the actual science. And so this is just one example of one agency that is overreaching. We've got other examples. You've got the IRS using the dog ate my homework excuse to duck responsibility. We've also got the Department of Veterans Affairs failing to provide adequate care for our heroes. When he established the VA, President Abraham Lincoln promised that our nation would take care of our men and women in uniform and their families who have served and defended our country. Mr. Speaker, it's an understatement to say that today the VA is failing and falling extremely short of that promise President Lincoln made. Our soldiers, sailors, airmen, and Marines have endured traumatic experiences on the battlefield and should not have to continue to fight to receive proper care when they return home. Make no mistake, there are many good and dedicated people at VA medical facilities all across the country who do a tremendous job every day caring for our veterans. In fact, many of the folks working at VA facilities are veterans themselves. The problem is a bureaucracy that has gotten so massive and so out of control that resources are wasted and the quality of care delivered to veterans has decreased. This culture of unaccountability has led to long wait times, 10,000 disability claims still in backlog, and millions of our tax dollars wasted. Our veterans are being ignored and tragically, in some cases, left to die. It was George Washington who has been talked about by my colleagues. Mr. Walker mentioned that this is the anniversary of him resigning his commission. George Washington said, "The willingness with which our young people are likely to serve in any war, no matter how justified, shall be directly proportional to how they perceive the veterans of earlier wars were treated and appreciated by their nation." Mr. Speaker, I know we will continue our efforts to reshape the culture at the VA, but it's high time this administration takes responsibility and joins those of us who want to give veterans a choice. Every veteran in this country should have the choice to go to any doctor of their choosing, and the VA should not have to pre-approve it. And then the VA should pay for that medical care. And that's the proposal that I've talked about. I think that's the way that we can finally end these wait times, we can break down these backlogs. And I call on the administration to work with us. It's time for the people to have accountability from their government. It's time for our veterans to have accountability from the VA. They put everything on the line for our country, for our freedom. It's time for us to do the same. God bless our veterans and their families. It's time to get to work. And with that, Mr. Speaker, I will yield back to my colleague, Mr. Walker.
Thank you, Representative Hudson, for the passionate remarks on our veterans. It is a shame, the abuse that we see sometimes in the veterans, but there's probably been no greater abuse than that of our own Internal Revenue system. With 75,000 pages, 8,000 pages that have been added to under this administration, we can see why abuse and corruption exist. What better person to speak on that than an economics professor, a new member of the Congress from Virginia, Congressman Dave Brat. I yield my time to Mr. Brat.
Thank you, Speaker. Thank you, Mr. Walker. Earlier this month, more details emerged about the IRS's targeting of conservative groups, where the agency tried to extort information on donors, find out what members talked about at their meetings, and probe into what members did in their very free time. We learned this month that the IRS had set up yet another roadblock to prevent Congress and the American people from getting to the bottom of this scandal. The IRS established a team of hundreds of lawyers to redact information from the documents Congress had requested for its investigations. This obstruction makes me extremely concerned for every American who voices political beliefs that don't agree with this administration's, whether they are conservative, liberal, green, religious, or agnostic. I'm grateful for the organization in my own district that exposed this scandal to the American people. The Richmond Tea Party was the first in the country to go public with the IRS's abuse. Once it was exposed, conservative groups from all over the country came forward and revealed that they were victims of the same IRS tactics. The IRS specifically targeted groups with Tea Party and Patriot in their names because of their political positions. The IRS targeted them for increased scrutiny, and it delayed processing their applications for nonprofit status. Let me go over that again just real slowly so the American people understand what's going on here. The Tea Party group, the T, stands for Taxed Enough Already. They are being targeted by the very government agency tasked with ensuring fairness in our tax revenue collection system. The irony could not be clearer. The groups were subjected to unprecedented and intimidating questioning. The IRS demanded resumes of board members, lists of all donors, and screenshots of blogs and social media posts to determine if their speech was acceptable to the big brother government. The agency asked some groups for minutes of every board meeting, as well as lists of positions they took on certain issues. On April 15, 2009, thousands of average Virginians showed up to the Richmond Tea Party's first rally in the pouring rain to stand together against government run amok and President Obama's promise to fundamentally transform America. People became engaged, many for the first time. After word of IRS targeting broke, people stopped coming to meetings and stopped giving money for fear of being targeted themselves. It's been 2 years since the Justice Department opened its investigation, and it's been 2 years of waiting as nothing ever seems to happen. The IRS has tried to cover its tracks at every turn. It lied to the public and to this Congress about its secret targeting program. To this day, document requests submitted by Congress remain unfulfilled. The IRS complained it had lost thousands of emails belonging to Lois Lerner. Since then, the Inspector General recovered more than 6,000 of them. They were located where anyone would expect, in the IRS Data Backup Facility. Congress held Lois Lerner in contempt after she claimed she knew nothing about the targeting and refused to answer questions about it. Yet the Obama Justice Department, has never prosecuted her. This all creates the frightening potential that we could see a repeat of this very same behavior in the future. We need this president and this administration to live up to their promise of transparency rather than their practice of obstruction. And we in Congress can put an end to this kind of mistreatment of our citizens by passing a fair tax or a flat tax. Either tax system would treat citizens more equally and would take away the IRS's power to discriminate and investigate against Americans who hold beliefs contrary to those in power. Ladies and gentlemen, the right to express your political views is so critical to the foundation of a free society that it's enshrined in our First Amendment. The First Amendment. Our very freedoms and the future of our constitutional form of government depend on the ability of all Americans to freely exercise that right. That's why it's incumbent upon this Congress to put forth every effort to protect that precious right and to hold those who would infringe upon it accountable to the fullest extent of the law. Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I yield back. Thank you, Mr. Walker.